In the spring of 1942, somewhere in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, a massive steel vessel cut through calm waters, her crew utterly convinced of her invincibility. The men aboard had just witnessed something extraordinary. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft had attacked their ship, and she had absorbed the punishment with what seemed like supernatural resilience. Pilots from the Imperial Japanese Navy, some of the most skilled aviators the world had ever seen, had thrown everything they had at this American carrier. Bombs had fallen, torpedoes had struck, and yet, impossibly, she remained afloat. The crew's spirits soared as they fought the fires and patched the damage. They believed with absolute certainty that they had won. They had saved their beloved ship from destruction. But deep in the shadowy compartments below the flight deck, something sinister was happening, something invisible, something deadly. Gasoline vapors were seeping through ruptured fuel lines, accumulating in enclosed spaces, creating an atmosphere so volatile that it required only the smallest ignition source to transform the entire vessel into a catastrophic inferno. The fumes spread silently, patiently, like a predator stalking its prey. And then, at precisely 12:47 in the afternoon, somewhere in the mechanical guts of the great ship, a single spark found its way into that lethal mixture. What happened next transcended the conventional understanding of naval warfare. This wasn't about Japanese bombs or torpedoes anymore. This wasn't enemy action in any traditional sense. What unfolded was something far more terrible, far more intimate. The ship was being consumed from within, destroyed not by a foreign adversary, but by the very systems designed to give her power and purpose. A sailor who survived the ordeal would later struggle to find words adequate to describe what he witnessed, finally settling on a simple, haunting phrase that captured the horror perfectly. He said it wasn't a battle anymore, it had become a furnace. The ship they loved, the ship they trusted, had transformed into something unrecognizable, something primordial and merciless. This is the story of the USS Lexington, a vessel whose crew affectionately called her Lady Lex, and how she came to be destroyed not by enemy hands, but by forces unleashed within her own steel body. It's a story that requires us to step back and understand not just what happened on that terrible day, but why it happened and what it meant for the entire course of the Pacific War. Try to picture, if you can, a completely new kind of naval engagement. Imagine a battle where the massive warships involved never once fire their enormous guns at each other. There's no thunderous roar of 16-inch artillery pieces, no dramatic silhouettes of battleships emerging from the mist to trade salvos across miles of open water. The entire character of naval warfare had shifted, fundamentally and irrevocably. The ocean itself had become transformed into an enormous three-dimensional chessboard, stretching across hundreds of miles in every direction, where the decisive weapons were no longer the ships themselves, but the aircraft they carried. Standing at the very center of this revolutionary new form of combat was one particular symbol of American naval power. The sailors who served aboard her didn't call her by her official designation. To them, she was simply Lady Lex, a nickname spoken with genuine affection and pride. The USS Lexington was far more than a naval vessel in the conventional sense. She was essentially a floating city constructed entirely of steel, displacing tens of thousands of tons, carrying within her hull and on her flight deck nearly 100 combat aircraft of various types. There were stubby Wildcat fighters, built to be rugged rather than graceful. There were dauntless dive bombers, ungainly-looking machines that nonetheless possessed a deadly precision. And there were Devastator torpedo bombers, aircraft that would prove tragically vulnerable in combat. Each of these machines represented a delicate balance between fire and sky, between the destructive power they carried and the fragility of their own construction. And the Lexington herself was the beating heart of American naval power in the Pacific theater, a concentration of offensive capability unlike anything the world had seen before. In May of 1942, this remarkable vessel was sailing toward what would prove to be her final and most crucial test. The date is important to understand. Only 5 months had passed since the devastating Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had plunged the United States into World War II. Those 5 months had been an unbroken string of Japanese victories, a relentless advance across the Pacific that seemed unstoppable. The Imperial Japanese Navy had swept across vast distances, smashing one Allied stronghold after another, each conquest written in fire and blood and marked by the rising sun flag being planted on territory that had, until recently, seemed secure. The momentum was entirely on Japan's side, and their strategists were now looking toward their next objective with considerable confidence. Their eyes had turned toward a place called Port Moresby, located on the southern coast of New Guinea. This might seem like an obscure location, just another tropical outpost in a war full of obscure locations, but its strategic importance was enormous. If the Japanese could capture Port Moresby, they would effectively sever the vital supply lines connecting Australia to American forces. An entire continent, an entire Allied nation, would be left exposed and isolated, cut off from reinforcement and support, vulnerable to further Japanese operations. The implications were staggering. Australia could be neutralized as a base for Allied operations. The Japanese defensive perimeter would expand dramatically. The balance of power in the Pacific would shift even further in Japan's favor. To accomplish this crucial objective, the Imperial Japanese Navy did not send a conventional assault force of cruisers and battleships. Instead, they dispatched their most precious assets, their crown jewels. 2 massive fleet carriers sailed south toward the Coral Sea. Their names were Shokaku and Zuikaku, and they represented the cutting edge of Japanese naval aviation. These were steel dragons, enormous vessels filled with legendary Mitsubishi Zero fighters and crewed by veteran pilots who had participated in Japan's stunning victories across Asia and the Pacific. These aviators had humbled the British, the Dutch, the Americans. They had developed a reputation for invincibility, for near supernatural skill in aerial combat. Sailing to meet them were 2 American carriers. One was the Yorktown, the other was the Lexington. They were under the overall command of Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, a career naval officer now facing perhaps the most consequential decisions of his life. The odds were not in the Americans' favor, and everyone involved understood this brutal calculus. American pilots were young, many of them with only months of actual combat experience under their belts. Some had graduated from flight training only weeks before finding themselves in the crucible of Pacific combat. Their aircraft, while rugged and reliable, were slower and heavier and less maneuverable than the elegant Zeros that would be hunting them. The Wildcats they flew were tough machines, capable of absorbing punishment, but they couldn't turn with a Zero, couldn't climb with a Zero, couldn't match the Japanese fighters in a dogfight on equal terms. But the Americans possessed one weapon that the Japanese did not, and it was perhaps the most important weapon of all. They had the determination, born of desperation and conviction, to hold the line at absolutely any cost. They knew what was at stake. They understood that Australia hung in the balance, that the entire strategic situation in the Pacific could pivot on the outcome of this engagement. They were willing to pay whatever price was necessary. The Coral Sea stretched out beneath them, impossibly blue and deceptively calm, as though the ocean itself was oblivious to the violence about to be unleashed upon its surface. On the morning of May 8, 1942, the primitive radar systems of both fleets began flickering with contacts. Scout planes, sent out before dawn to search hundreds of square miles of ocean, returned with urgent reports. Each fleet had located the other, though they were separated by more than 100 miles of open water. Neither admiral could actually see his enemy with his own eyes. Neither could know with certainty the full strength of the forces arrayed against him. Intelligence was fragmentary, uncertain, potentially misleading. And yet, despite this uncertainty, despite the fog of war that obscured everything, both admirals arrived at the same conclusion and gave the same order to their subordinates: launch everything. The squadrons thundered off the flight decks, engines roaring, propellers clawing at the tropical air. They were tiny black specks vanishing into the immense blue horizon, each pilot carrying on his shoulders the weight of nations, the fate of strategies, the lives of thousands of men on the ships below. The deck of the Lexington shuddered and trembled as dauntless dive bombers struggled into the sky, heavily laden with 1,000-pound bombs. Men working the flight line, the deck crews who guided the aircraft and armed them and fueled them, watched until the very last speck had disappeared from view. All they could do now was wait and pray that at least some of those men would return. Several hours later, the sky itself seemed to tear open. Zero fighters slashed downward out of the sun like surgical scalpels, their wings glinting, their machine guns chattering. Dauntless bombers pushed over into their characteristic screaming dives, plunging through blossoms of anti-aircraft fire that filled the sky with black puffs of shrapnel. And then came the hammer blows, the impacts that every carrier dreaded more than anything else. Torpedoes, launched from low-flying Japanese attack planes, slammed into the Lexington's port side with tremendous force. Bombs, dropped with precision from altitude, ripped through her flight deck, penetrating deep into her vitals before exploding. The Lady Lex trembled under these impacts, her steel frame shuddered, but she did not fall. She did not break in half. She did not sink immediately. Her damage control teams raced into action with practiced efficiency, fighting back the fires, sealing ruptured compartments, pumping out water that was flooding into spaces below the waterline. The crew worked with fierce determination, and as the minutes passed and the ship remained afloat, their confidence began to grow. They started to believe, with increasing certainty, that she might yet survive this ordeal. They might yet bring her home. But what none of them could see, what none of them could know in those crucial minutes after the attack, was that destiny had already written a different ending to this story. The true catastrophe that would destroy the Lexington was not the enemy's bombs or torpedoes. It was something hidden deep within her own steel veins, something that her own design had inadvertently created. The real horror, the final act of this tragedy, was still gathering in the darkness below decks, still building toward its terrible climax. To truly understand why the Lexington met her fate in the waters of the Coral Sea, we need to step back from the immediate drama of the battle itself and examine the larger context. This engagement was not simply a matter of ships and planes clashing in the sky above a remote patch of ocean. What was unfolding here was something far more profound. It was the collision of two entirely different philosophies of warfare, two fundamentally opposed approaches to naval combat, two visions of how battles should be fought and won. For nearly a century, ever since Japan had first begun building a modern navy in the late 19th century, Japanese naval doctrine had been shaped and dominated by a single powerful idea. They called it Kantai Keson, which translates roughly as the decisive battle. The leaders of the Imperial Japanese Navy believed with an almost religious conviction that victory in any future war would come from a single crushing engagement, one perfect duel, one climactic moment where an elite fleet would annihilate its enemy in a stroke so devastating that further resistance would become impossible. Every aircraft, every pilot, every warship, every tactical innovation was trained and built and designed with this moment in mind. All of Japanese naval strategy pointed toward this hypothetical decisive battle, like compass needles pointing toward magnetic north. The Imperial Japanese Navy invested heavily, almost obsessively, in achieving excellence. Its carrier air groups were not merely military units assembled from whoever happened to be available. They were brotherhoods of warriors, carefully selected, rigorously trained, hardened by years of intensive preparation. The Zero fighters they flew were not just machines, but extensions of their pilots' will, aircraft so responsive and agile that they seemed to dance through the sky rather than merely fly through it. They were fast, graceful, and absolutely lethal in the hands of a skilled aviator. Men like Saburo Sakai embodied this doctrine perfectly. He was deadly, disciplined, seemingly untouchable, capable of aerial maneuvers that American pilots could barely comprehend, let alone replicate. But this obsessive pursuit of perfection contained within it a fatal flaw, a weakness that would eventually prove catastrophic. Excellence of this kind could not be replaced. Every lost ace, every destroyed aircraft represented a wound that would heal slowly, if it healed at all. Japan simply did not possess the vast industrial and human resources necessary to rapidly replenish its forces. Its military strength was built on a foundation of talent, of years of training, of irreplaceable expertise. And once that foundation was bled away, once those talented pilots were killed in combat, there was no way to quickly restore what had been lost. New pilots could be trained, yes, but they would not possess the skills of the men they replaced. New aircraft could be built, but not in the quantities needed to offset losses in a prolonged conflict. The United States approached warfare from an entirely different philosophical standpoint. The US Navy did not seek one perfect duel to decide history. They did not believe that wars were won in single climactic engagements. Instead, they prepared for what they called a war of attrition, what some strategists referred to as the tonnage war. The underlying plan was brutally simple in its logic. Outbuild your enemy, outlast your enemy, grind down his forces through sustained pressure until he no longer possessed the means to continue fighting. To American strategists, a carrier like the Lexington was not a singular, irreplaceable treasure that must be preserved at all costs. She was certainly powerful, certainly valuable, but she was also fundamentally the product of a system that could produce more carriers, more aircraft, more of everything. Every pilot mattered, every life had value, but behind each individual pilot stood a vast flood of trainees already moving through the pipeline, already learning to fly, already preparing to join the fight. It was a doctrine born not of elegance or martial philosophy, but of industrial capacity. It was pragmatic rather than romantic. It accepted losses as inevitable and planned accordingly. And now, in the waters of the Coral Sea, these two radically different visions would clash directly for the first time. Japan's immediate goal was straightforward. Capture Port Moresby. Establish it as a forward base. Use it as a dagger pointed directly at Australia's throat. If this objective could be achieved, Japanese bombers would be able to threaten major Australian cities like Darwin, Sydney and Brisbane. Australia itself could be cut off from American support, isolated, forced to fight alone or potentially forced out of the war entirely. The strategic implications rippled outward in every direction. To defend against this, the United States Navy committed 2 carrier task forces to the region. The Yorktown and the Lexington, escorted by cruisers and destroyers, steamed into the Coral Sea under Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's command. Their mission could not have been clearer or more urgent. Block the Japanese invasion convoy. Prevent the capture of Port Moresby. Do this at any cost necessary. But cost was precisely what American pilots feared most. Many of them were barely older than the aircraft they flew. They were young men, some still teenagers, suddenly thrust into mortal combat against enemy aviators with years of experience. Their Wildcat fighters were slower than the legendary Zeros. Their dauntless dive bombers were rugged and reliable, but their design dated back to the late 1930s. And their torpedo bombers, the TBD Devastators, were practically flying coffins, slow and vulnerable, and desperately in need of replacement by something, anything more modern. Still, even in these early desperate days of the war, innovation was beginning to stir among American pilots. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch, watching his men struggle helplessly against the superior performance of Zero fighters, had devised a defensive tactic that would eventually become famous throughout the naval aviation community. He called it the Thatch Weave. The concept was elegantly simple. 2 fighters would fly in tandem, deliberately crisscrossing their flight paths in a carefully coordinated pattern. When a Zero dove on one Wildcat, the second Wildcat would be positioned to fire at the attacking Zero from an angle the Japanese pilot wouldn't expect. It transformed 2 mediocre fighters into a single defensive unit that was far more effective than either aircraft could be alone. It was innovation born of necessity, creativity emerging from desperation. The first contacts between the opposing forces came on May 7th, but through a combination of poor visibility and sheer bad luck, neither side initially found the other's main carrier force. Japanese bombers, searching desperately for American carriers, instead stumbled upon an American oiler and a destroyer. In their eagerness and confusion, they attacked these vessels thinking they had crippled a major warship. The fog of war, that ancient principle that ensures nothing in combat ever goes according to plan, spared both fleets for one more day. But May 8th would be fundamentally different. On that morning, the scouts finally located their true targets. The veil of uncertainty was lifted. From the carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, the Japanese unleashed wave after wave of Zero fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes. From Lexington and Yorktown, American squadrons roared skyward to meet them in what would become one of the first major carrier versus carrier battles in history. The sky over the Coral Sea transformed into a storm of fire and steel and desperate courage. Bombs screamed downward from altitude, their passage marked by that distinctive whistling sound that every sailor dreaded. Torpedoes churned white trails beneath the surface as they raced toward their targets. Fighters twisted and turned in desperate aerial duels. Anti-aircraft fire filled the air with lethal shrapnel. And in just a few minutes of concentrated violence, the Lexington was struck multiple times. 2 torpedoes slammed into her hull below the waterline. 2 bombs penetrated her flight deck and exploded in her interior spaces. The impacts made the entire massive ship shudder like a living thing in pain. The Lady Lex was grievously wounded, there could be no doubt about that, but her crew fought with furious determination to contain the damage. They battled the flames with hoses and chemical extinguishers. They sealed ruptured compartments. They shored up weakened bulkheads. They pumped out flooding water. And gradually, impossibly, they seemed to be winning this desperate struggle. The fires appeared to be under control. The ship remained on an even keel. Her engines continued to function. As the minutes stretched into hours, the crew's confidence grew. They genuinely believed they had survived the worst of what the Japanese could throw at them. But the true danger, the real threat to the Lexington's survival, had only just begun to manifest. What would follow in the hours ahead was not the result of enemy action. It was a flaw built directly into the ship's very design, a vulnerability that nobody had fully appreciated until it was too late to matter. In the chaos and violence of May 8th, both sides initially believed they had landed devastating blows against their enemies. Japan's attack squadrons had torn into the Lexington with bombs and torpedoes, scoring direct hits that would have sunk lesser vessels immediately. American pilots, meanwhile, had struck back fiercely at the Shokaku, one of Japan's most prized fleet carriers, damaging her so severely that she would be forced to withdraw from combat. Neither side could see the complete picture through all the smoke and confusion and contradictory reports. But hidden within that confused struggle, a quiet American innovation was beginning to fundamentally shift the balance of power. It was not the Wildcat fighter that gave the United States its crucial edge in carrier warfare. The Wildcat was tough, certainly, capable of absorbing battle damage that would destroy more fragile aircraft. But it was also slower than the Zero, less graceful, less feared by Japanese pilots who had learned they could usually outmaneuver American fighters in a turning fight. Nor was it the lumbering Devastator torpedo bomber that would prove decisive. The Devastator was, by 1942, already obsolete, a sitting duck for enemy fighters, little more than a target struggling through the sky toward an objective it would rarely reach. The true weapon of revolutionary change was the SBD Dauntless dive bomber. At first glance, this aircraft seemed almost comically unimpressive. It was slow compared to fighters. Its basic airframe design looked outdated to anyone familiar with modern aircraft. Japanese pilots openly mocked it as the clumsy bird, something to be swatted from the sky with ease. But what those Japanese pilots could not dismiss, what they learned to fear and respect, was the Dauntless's precision. The aircraft was built for exactly one purpose, designed around a single tactical concept: the dive. From an altitude of 20,000 feet or more, high enough that the carrier below looked like a tiny grey rectangle on the blue ocean, the Dauntless would roll inverted and then push over into a near-vertical descent. The pilot would point the nose straight down at his target and then let gravity do its work, accelerating toward the ocean at speeds exceeding 240 knots. Special air brakes, perforated panels that extended from the wings, would snap open with a distinctive roaring sound, steadying the plunge, preventing the aircraft from accelerating beyond control. The pilot, blood draining from his head under the tremendous G-forces, would peer through his bomb sight at the target rushing up toward him, and at precisely the right moment, at an altitude carefully calculated to maximize accuracy while minimizing exposure to anti-aircraft fire, he would release his 1,000-pound bomb. The bomb would separate from the aircraft and continue downward on a ballistic trajectory while the pilot, with every ounce of strength in his body, hauled back on the control stick. The Dauntless would groan under the stress as it pulled out of the dive, G-forces crushing the pilot down into his seat, vision narrowing to a tunnel, consciousness hanging by a thread. And then, if everything went right, if the pilot had judged everything correctly, the aircraft would level out just above the waves and race away while behind it. The bomb would strike home. This was not guesswork. This was not dropping bombs from high altitude and hoping they might hit somewhere near the target. This was ruthless, surgical accuracy. A well-trained dive bomber pilot could place his bomb within a circle just a few yards across from an altitude of thousands of feet. He could aim not at a general area, not at a vague patch of ocean containing an enemy ship, but at a specific point on that ship's deck. He could target the elevator that brought aircraft up from the hangar. He could target the island superstructure. He could target the fuel storage areas. This precision made even a massive steel carrier, a vessel displacing tens of thousands of tons, suddenly vulnerable in a way that battleship admirals still struggled to fully comprehend. This was where American tactical doctrine came alive and demonstrated its true potential. While Japan continued to rely heavily on the individual brilliance of ace pilots, the United States Navy was systematically learning to fight as an integrated system. They developed what they called the Alpha Strike, a carefully coordinated attack involving multiple types of aircraft working in precisely timed sequence. It was a symphony of coordinated violence, each element playing its designated role. The Wildcat fighters would go in first, throwing themselves directly at the Zero squadrons that rose to defend the enemy carriers. The Wildcats' job was not necessarily to shoot down every defending fighter. Their mission was simpler and more brutal. Buy time, create confusion, force the enemy combat air patrol to engage, to commit, to focus on the wrong threat. Every second the Zeros spent chasing Wildcats was a second they weren't attacking the bombers that followed. Next came the Devastator torpedo bombers, lumbering in low across the waves, slow and vulnerable, but absolutely demanding attention. Japanese carriers had to turn to evade torpedoes. Their anti-aircraft guns had to depress to fire at these low-flying attackers. Defending fighters had to dive down from altitude to intercept them. The Devastators dragged Japanese attention and firepower low, down to wave-top level, and held it there. And then, from the clouds high above, unseen until the last possible moment, the Dauntlesses would push over into their dives. By the time Japanese lookouts spotted them, it was already too late. The ships below had already exhausted much of their defensive fire on the Wildcats and Devastators. The combat air patrol was out of position, too low to intercept dive bombers plunging from 20,000 feet. And in the minute or two it took the Dauntlesses to complete their attack, there was almost nothing the defenders could do except brace for impact. It was not an elegant system. It was certainly not a cost-effective system, measured in American lives lost. But it worked, it was effective, and effectiveness, in warfare, ultimately matters more than elegance. The Shoho, a Japanese light carrier that had been escorting the invasion force, learned this truth the hard way on May 7th. American bombers had swarmed over her in a brutal, overwhelming display of coordinated firepower. The radio transmission that followed would become famous throughout the US Navy. Scratch one flat top, a pilot reported calmly, his voice crackling through static as explosions tore the Shoho apart and flames rolled across her decks. Within minutes, the carrier was gone, slipping beneath the waves. It marked the first time in the entire war that a Japanese aircraft carrier had been sunk, and it sent a clear, unmistakable message to both sides. The Americans had found a way to kill dragons. They had developed a tactical system capable of destroying Japan's most powerful naval assets. But innovation wasn't only about machines and tactics. It was also about something more fundamental, something harder to quantify but equally important. It was about survival, about resilience, about the determination to keep fighting even after taking devastating damage. On the Yorktown, a bomb had ripped through the flight deck and exploded deep inside the ship, killing dozens of men and starting fires that threatened to spread out of control. By all conventional measures, the carrier should have been crippled, forced to withdraw from combat, possibly even abandoned if the damage proved too severe. But the Yorktown's crew absolutely refused to let their ship die. Damage control teams raced through smoke-filled compartments, working in conditions that would have broken lesser men. They sealed ruptures in bulkheads. They patched holes in the hull. They pumped out thousands of gallons of water that had flooded into spaces below the waterline. They worked until their hands were blistered raw and their lungs burned from smoke inhalation. Hours later, to the complete disbelief of Japanese intelligence officers who had marked the Yorktown as destroyed, or at least neutralized, she was still afloat. More than that, she was still operational, still capable of launching and recovering aircraft, still very much in the fight. Battered, certainly. Wounded, yes, but alive. Defiant. It was proof of another American weapon that couldn't be measured in tons of displacement or numbers of aircraft. It was resilience, the capacity to absorb punishment and keep functioning, the refusal to accept defeat. The Japanese forces did not have that same luxury, and this asymmetry would prove increasingly important as the war continued. When the Shokaku was struck by American dive bombers and severely damaged, her structural integrity compromised, her flight deck torn apart, she had no choice but to withdraw from the battle. Her highly trained air groups, already depleted by combat losses, could not be quickly rebuilt or replaced. Pilots who had died that day represented years of institutional knowledge, thousands of hours of flight experience, tactical expertise that simply could not be recreated quickly. For Japan, where each skilled pilot was the product of years of intensive training, every loss was essentially irreplaceable. The pipeline that created new aviators was long and narrow, capable of producing excellence, but incapable of producing it in quantity. For the United States, the situation was fundamentally different. Every sacrifice was mourned, every lost pilot was grieved by his comrades and his family. But behind each one stood replacement pilots already moving through training programs, already learning to fly, already preparing to join the fleet. The American training pipeline was shorter, less focused on creating individual excellence, but far more capable of producing competent pilots in large numbers. By the end of that violent day on May 8th, both navies had paid a terrible price in blood and steel. But only one side had revealed a weapon system that would ultimately decide the outcome of the entire Pacific War. The slow, ungainly, supposedly obsolete Dauntless dive bomber had demonstrated beyond any doubt that it could pierce the very heart of Japan's naval doctrine. From the Coral Sea to Midway to the Philippine Sea, it would remain the primary striking weapon of American carrier forces, the spearhead that would sink carrier after carrier until Japan's naval aviation arm was finally bled white. And yet, even amid these emerging sparks of tactical innovation and American resilience, a profound tragedy still hung over the immediate horizon. Because while the Yorktown had endured her wounds and remained operational, while she had proven the value of American damage control training and sheer stubborn determination, the Lexington's wounds ran far deeper than anyone initially realized. Deep in her steel vitals, invisible to the men fighting fires on the flight deck, a silent danger was steadily building toward a catastrophic climax. The true horror of Lady Lex's fate had not yet begun to unfold. At first, in those hours immediately following the Japanese attack, there seemed to be genuine reason for optimism about the Lexington's chances of survival. Yes, she had taken serious damage. 2 torpedo impacts had torn massive holes in her hull below the waterline, allowing the sea to pour into compartments that were supposed to remain dry. 2 bombs had penetrated her armoured flight deck and exploded in her interior spaces, killing men and starting fires and wreaking havoc on her internal systems. Her hull was torn. Her flight deck was ripped apart in places. Debris littered her decks. The smell of smoke and burning fuel pervaded everything. Yet despite all of this, her massive engines were still running, still turning her propeller shafts, still giving her forward motion through the water. Damage control parties had swarmed throughout the ship, working with desperate efficiency. They were sealing compartments to prevent flooding from spreading. They were fighting flames with every tool available. They were shoring up weakened structures. By late morning, as the hours accumulated and the ship continued to float, continued to respond to her helm, the mood aboard Lady Lex had genuinely begun to shift. Perhaps, the crew thought with growing hope, just perhaps they could bring her home. Perhaps she could limp back to Pearl Harbor, or even all the way to the West Coast, to the shipyards where she could be properly repaired and returned to service. But the real enemy facing the Lexington was not the Japanese Navy. It was not torpedoes or bombs or even the fires that still smouldered in some compartments. The true threat was something hidden inside her own arteries and veins of steel, something that nobody could see or touch or even fully understand until it was far too late. Beneath her decks, distributed throughout her hull in a complex network of pipes and pumps and storage tanks, lay thousands upon thousands of gallons of aviation fuel. This fuel was the lifeblood that allowed her aircraft to operate. It was pumped from storage tanks deep in the ship up to the hangar deck and the flight deck, where it would be transferred into the fuel tanks of Wildcats and Dauntlesses and Devastators. The entire system was designed to be as efficient as possible, to minimize the time required to refuel aircraft and get them back into the air. But the torpedo hits that morning had done more damage than was immediately apparent. The explosions had ruptured fuel lines in multiple locations. Aviation gasoline, volatile and dangerous, began seeping from these breaks in the system. And because this was not crude oil or diesel fuel, but highly refined aviation gasoline, it didn't just leak out and pool harmlessly somewhere. It evaporated. It transformed from liquid into invisible vapor that was far more explosive than the liquid fuel itself. These fumes began spreading through compartments, seeping through ventilation systems, pooling in corners and low-lying areas, accumulating in spaces where men were working, creating an atmosphere so chemically saturated that it was essentially a bomb waiting for someone to light the fuse. Men working in the bowels of the ship, down where the sunlight never penetrated, where ventilation was poor and the air was already hot and stale, noticed the change almost immediately. The smell was unmistakable, impossible to ignore. It was sweet, one aviation mechanic would later recall with a shudder. The smell of gasoline was everywhere, thick and cloying and wrong. "I knew right then," he said. "We were walking on a powder keg. Every man who understood what aviation gasoline could do, every man who had seen fuel fires or knew the chemistry involved, felt a creeping sense of dread. They were inside a floating bomb. And somewhere, somehow, eventually, there would be a spark." At 12:47 in the afternoon, that spark came. The exact source would never be definitively determined, but the most likely explanation was heartbreakingly simple. Somewhere deep in the ship's machinery spaces, a motor that should have been shut down was still running. Perhaps in the chaos of damage control, someone forgot to throw the switch. Perhaps the motor's controls had been damaged in the attack. Perhaps it was just random chance, the cruel workings of probability. But that motor, operating normally, producing tiny electrical arcs as its brushes made contact with its commutator, sent out one invisible spark into an atmosphere saturated with gasoline vapor. The first explosion was not particularly loud, at least not compared to the thunderous impacts of bombs and torpedoes during the earlier attack. Survivors described it as a muffled whoomph, as though the ship itself had exhaled in sudden pain. But the shockwave from that initial detonation rolled through the Lexington's steel structure like a tremor through solid rock. Bulkheads trembled and flexed. Men working several decks away were knocked off their feet. Those who were closer felt it more viscerally, felt the deck leap beneath them, felt the entire ship shudder. And then came the chain reaction. The first explosion ignited gasoline vapors in adjacent compartments. Those explosions triggered others. Fire raced through ventilation ducts, following the paths that the vapors had taken. Within seconds, gasoline was igniting in compartments scattered throughout the ship, in spaces that had seemed safe just moments before. The explosions didn't stop. They continued, one after another, each feeding off the fumes that continued to seep from ruptured fuel lines that couldn't be shut down or sealed. Bombs that were stored in the ship's magazines, bombs that should have been safe and secure, began to cook off from the heat. The steel around them grew hotter and hotter until the explosives inside reached their detonation temperature. Then they would explode with tremendous force, adding to the chaos, blowing holes in bulkheads, starting new fires, killing anyone unfortunate enough to be nearby. Torpedoes, still cradled in their storage racks, waiting to be loaded onto aircraft, detonated like thunder, their warheads designed to sink enemy ships now tearing apart the very vessel that carried them. The Lexington had transformed into a volcano. She was being consumed from within by forces she could not contain and her crew could not stop. Above, on the flight deck, the situation was, if anything, even worse. Nearly 200 aircraft sat parked wing to wing in that tight arrangement that carriers used when they wanted to maximize the number of planes they could carry. There were dauntless dive bombers and Wildcat fighters. Some were still dripping fuel after having recently landed following the morning's combat missions. Others had been sitting there all morning, fully fueled and fully armed, waiting for orders to launch on another strike. Their fuel tanks were full. Their ammunition was loaded. Some even had bombs still attached beneath their wings. When the heat from the Inferno below began rising through the steel deck plates, when the temperature in the hangar deck beneath them climbed past hundreds of degrees, the result was inevitable. Tires began to melt first, rubber liquefying and igniting. Then fuel tanks ruptured from the internal pressure created by expanding gasoline vapor. One by one, sometimes several at once, the parked aircraft erupted into fireballs. Witnesses who survived described it as a chain of explosions rolling across the deck in waves, each detonation triggering others nearby. A Wildcat would twist grotesquely in the flames, its wings folding upward like broken arms, its fuselage melting before vanishing entirely in a pillar of fire. One gunner, stationed in a position that gave him a vantage point over much of the flight deck, later struggled to put his memories into words. "It wasn't a ship anymore," he finally said, his voice still haunted by what he had witnessed. "It was a furnace. We were standing on top of hell itself. The order went out to fight the Inferno, to save the ship if it could possibly be saved. Damage control teams rushed toward the flames with hoses and chemical extinguishers. But the fires were everywhere, absolutely everywhere. They were erupting from the hangar deck. They were venting through the elevator shafts. They were burning in the very heart of the carrier, in compartments that should have been protected, that were supposed to be safe. Men directed streams of water onto the flames, but the water boiled on contact with steel, heated to temperatures beyond imagination. The hoses themselves caught fire. Some damage control parties found themselves trapped between advancing walls of flame, cut off from any escape route, left with impossible choices about which way to run, which direction might offer even a chance of survival. Others ran blindly through smoke so thick they couldn't see their own hands, choking on toxic fumes, stumbling over debris and bodies, desperately trying to find their way to open air before their lungs gave out. Still others made it to the edge of the deck and simply jumped, preferring to take their chances in the ocean rather than remain on a ship that had become an inferno. By mid-afternoon, several hours into this catastrophe, Admiral Aubrey Fitch was forced to confront a truth that every naval officer dreads. The Lexington could not be saved. Her heart had been ruptured beyond any possibility of repair. Her body was burning itself alive. The fires were beyond control. The explosions continued. Men were dying in the attempt to save her. At 4:30 in the afternoon, Admiral Fitch gave what must have been the hardest order of his entire career: abandon ship. What followed was organized chaos, a desperate race against time. Thousands of men began climbing down ropes thrown over the side, the manila fibers rough against their hands as they descended toward the water far below. Others didn't bother with ropes. They simply leapt, dropping 30 or 40 feet into the coral sea and hoping they would miss the debris floating in the water. Lifeboats were lowered, though many capsized or were swamped by the number of men trying to climb aboard. Destroyers, the USS Hammond and USS Phelps, dashed to the Lexington's side with complete disregard for their own safety, maneuvering so close to the burning carrier that their own paint began to blister from the heat. These destroyers pulled survivors aboard even as explosions continued to shake the air around them, even as burning debris rained down from the Lexington's flight deck. Their crews formed human chains, hauling exhausted swimmers up over their sides, dragging injured men to safety, refusing to leave until every man they could possibly rescue had been pulled from the water. Incredibly, miraculously, more than 2,700 men would be rescued from the Lexington. Only 216 were lost, either killed in the initial Japanese attack or in the subsequent fires and explosions. Given the absolute scale of the disaster, given how completely the ship had been consumed by fire, this was nothing short of miraculous. It spoke to the courage of the men who stayed at their posts until the last possible moment, to the skill of the destroyer captains who risked their own ships to save others, to sheer blind luck that the worst explosions didn't occur until most of the crew had already gotten off. But the Lexington herself was doomed beyond any shadow of doubt. She had endured for hours after the first internal explosions, had refused to sink quickly or easily, as though some part of the ship's spirit was clinging to life out of sheer defiance. But no captain, no admiral could allow her to drift abandoned in enemy-controlled waters, still burning but still afloat, still armed with weapons that might be salvaged, still containing equipment and documents that could be valuable to the enemy. At 7:15 that evening, with the tropical sun sinking toward the western horizon, the destroyer USS Phelps moved into position to deliver a final mercy. 5 torpedoes were fired into Lady Lex's flaming side, the same type of torpedoes that had once been carried by her own aircraft, now turned against her in an act of necessary mercy-killing. The first 2 torpedoes, in a final bitter twist, failed to detonate. Perhaps they malfunctioned. Perhaps they simply struck at the wrong angle. But the next 3 ran true and struck with devastating force. Steel shrieked as the torpedo warheads detonated against her already ruptured hull. Her bow began to lift, rising slowly out of the water as flooding aft dragged her stern down. Smoke continued to pour skyward like the final breath of a dying giant, visible for miles in every direction, a pillar marking the spot where Lady Lex would make her final descent. Then slowly, almost gracefully, as though she had accepted her fate and was embracing it with dignity, the Lexington rolled onto her side and began to slip beneath the waves. For hours afterward, the survivors watched from the decks of the destroyers that had rescued them. They watched as the sea swallowed their ship whole, taking with her the wreckage of 200 aircraft, thousands of tons of steel representing some of America's most advanced naval technology, and the spirit of a vessel they had called home. Some men wept openly and without shame. Others simply stood in silence, saluting as the last of her superstructure disappeared beneath the surface. All of them knew they had witnessed something more than just the sinking of a warship. They had witnessed the death of a legend, the end of a ship that had represented American naval power and prestige. The Lady Lex was gone, erased from the surface of the ocean, consigned to the depths where she rests to this day. But her sacrifice, as it turned out, was not in vain, not meaningless, not wasted, because even as she was dying, even as she was being consumed by her own internal fires, she had accomplished her mission. The Japanese invasion convoy that had been bound for Port Moresby, that had been carrying the troops and equipment necessary to capture that vital base, was turning back. Without carrier cover, exposed to potential air attacks from Allied land-based aircraft, facing an uncertain strategic situation, the Japanese had decided that the risks were too great. They withdrew. Still, even as the last survivors were being pulled from the water, one question lingered in every mind. What would this loss mean for America? Was the Coral Sea a defeat? Had they lost more than they could afford to lose? Or had the Lexington's fiery end, had all those lives sacrificed, purchased something greater? Something that would echo through the entire remainder of the Pacific War? The answer to that question would only become clear in the weeks and months that followed. When the smoke finally cleared over the Coral Sea, when both fleets had withdrawn and the immediate danger had passed, both sides immediately rushed to proclaim victory. From Japan's perspective, they had significant reasons to claim success. They had sunk one of America's great fleet carriers, the mighty Lexington. They had destroyed nearly 200 American aircraft. They had demonstrated once again that Japanese pilots and Japanese aircraft were superior in individual combat. These were not small achievements, and Japanese propagandists made the most of them, trumpeting the destruction of Lady Lex as proof of continued Japanese dominance. But wars are never measured solely in ships lost or aircraft destroyed. They are measured in strategic objectives achieved or denied. They are measured in momentum gained or lost. They are measured in what comes next, in how the balance of power shifts going forward. The Japanese strategic plan for the Coral Sea operation had been crystal clear from the beginning. Seize Port Moresby. Establish it as a major forward base. From that position, they would be able to cut the vital supply lines connecting Australia to American forces. They could strangle an entire continent, force it into isolation, extend their defensive perimeter dramatically southward, and potentially even threaten the Australian mainland itself with bombing raids and possible invasion. The capture of Port Moresby was meant to be the next step in an unbroken string of Japanese victories, another extension of the empire, another expansion of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. But after the Coral Sea, that entire plan lay in ruins. The invasion convoy, its troop transports filled with soldiers who would never set foot on Port Moresby's beaches, was ordered to turn back. The risk was simply too great. Without carrier air cover to protect them, without control of the sea and sky around New Guinea, those transports would be sitting ducks for any Allied air attacks. Australia was saved from the immediate threat of isolation. The southward expansion of the Japanese Empire had been stopped. For the first time since Pearl Harbor had plunged the Pacific into war, Japanese strategic momentum had been broken. One American officer, when asked years later about the significance of losing the Lexington, put it with perfect clarity. "Yes," he said, "we lost the Lexington. That hurt badly. But we saved Australia, and I'd make that trade any day of the week." Yet the true cost to Japan ran far deeper than most observers understood at the time. The light carrier Shoho was gone, sunk on May 7th in a matter of minutes under a devastating American air attack. The fleet carrier Shokaku had been battered, her flight deck torn apart, her hull ripped open by multiple bomb hits, forced to withdraw from combat and limp back to Japan for months of repairs. And the fleet carrier Zuikaku, while she had not been struck by a single bomb or torpedo, had nonetheless been crippled just as effectively. Her air groups had been mauled in combat, depleted to the point where she was no longer combat effective. The numbers were stark. Japan had lost nearly 100 naval aviators in the battle, pilots and aircrew who had been flying combat missions since the war began. These were not raw recruits or partially trained replacements. These were experienced combat veterans, men whose skills had been honed through years of intensive training and months of actual combat. To the Imperial Japanese Navy, operating under a doctrine that emphasized quality over quantity, that prized individual excellence above all else, these losses were absolutely devastating. Training a replacement pilot to the same level of competence would take years, not months. Creating a new ace, a pilot capable of the aerial mastery that men like Saburo Sakai demonstrated, required half a decade of intensive instruction. For the United States, the calculation was fundamentally different. Every lost American pilot was mourned. Every death was a tragedy for families and friends and squadron mates. But behind each individual loss stood a vast industrial and training infrastructure already working to produce replacements. American flight schools were graduating new pilots by the hundreds. Aircraft factories were rolling new planes off assembly lines at rates that Japanese industry simply could not match. The American system was designed specifically for this kind of attrition, built to sustain losses and replace them, to grind down an enemy through sheer weight of numbers. This represented the first visible crack in the myth of Japanese invincibility that had dominated the first months of the Pacific War. The decisive battle doctrine of Kantai Kessen, the idea that excellence and superior skill would carry the day in one perfect engagement, had a fundamental weakness that was now beginning to show. Perfection is inherently fragile, and once it's shattered, once those irreplaceable aces are dead and those perfectly maintained aircraft are destroyed, it cannot easily be rebuilt or restored. For the United States Navy, the Lexington's destruction was a lesson written in fire and blood, a lesson that would be studied and absorbed and ultimately lead to changes in carrier design. Her destruction had revealed critical flaws in how American carriers were constructed, the fuel lines running beneath the hangar decks, the way aviation gasoline was distributed throughout the ship, the vulnerability to internal explosions from fuel vapor. All of these design weaknesses would be addressed in future construction. The carriers that came after would incorporate new safeguards, new systems for venting fumes, new damage control procedures specifically designed to prevent the kind of cascading catastrophe that had destroyed the Lexington. The Navy had lost a ship, yes. They had lost men and aircraft and prestige. But in exchange, they had gained knowledge that would ultimately save countless other vessels and countless other lives in the battles still to come. This was the tonnage war philosophy in action. Accept losses. Learn from them. Incorporate those lessons into the next generation of weapons and tactics. Keep building. Keep improving. Keep grinding forward. There was another crucial lesson as well, something more intangible but equally important. The lesson was about resilience, about human courage and determination in the face of catastrophe. The survival of more than 2,700 crewmen from the Lexington was a testament to discipline and training and sheer stubborn refusal to give up. The destroyers Hammond and Phelps had braved flames and explosions, and the very real possibility that the Lexington might explode catastrophically at any moment, all to pull survivors from the water. Even in absolute catastrophe, even when a ship was literally tearing herself apart from internal fires and explosions, the United States Navy had proven it could preserve its most precious asset, which was not steel or aircraft, but the men who operated them. For Japan, the Coral Sea represented far more than just a tactical setback or a single failed operation. It was a genuine strategic turning point, though this wasn't immediately obvious at the time. The battle's true significance would only become clear 1 month later, when another engagement would be fought in the waters around a tiny atoll called Midway. When that battle came, when the fate of the Pacific hung in the balance during those desperate hours in early June 1942, the absence of shokaku and zuikaku from the Japanese order of battle would prove absolutely crucial. Japan's plan for Midway called for overwhelming carrier strength, for the kind of concentrated force that could sweep away American resistance in a single devastating blow. But instead of having 6 fleet carriers available, they could only bring 4. The Shokaku was still undergoing repairs for the damage she'd sustained in the Coral Sea. The Zuikaku was technically operational, but her depleted air groups meant she couldn't be committed to combat. Instead of veteran pilots with months or years of combat experience, Japan was forced to fill out their squadrons with greener, less experienced aviators. Instead of the overwhelming superiority they'd enjoyed in earlier battles, they went into Midway on much more equal terms with the American forces arrayed against them. The result was catastrophe. 4 Japanese fleet carriers destroyed in a single day. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, all sent to the bottom. The absolute heart of Japan's carrier fleet, the core of their naval aviation capability, torn out in one brutal engagement. The Coral Sea, then, was not just a clash of ships and aircraft over a remote patch of tropical ocean. It was the hinge of history, the point where the momentum of the Pacific War shifted decisively. It proved that Japan could be stopped, that their seemingly unstoppable advance could be blunted by determined resistance. It proved that aircraft carriers, not battleships, now dominated naval warfare, that the age of the dreadnought was over and a new era had begun. And it proved that sacrifice, even the enormous sacrifice of losing a ship like the Lexington, could purchase strategic objectives of immense value. On May 8, 1942, the Lady Lex died in fire. She was consumed by forces she could not control, destroyed not by enemy action, but by the consequences of her own damaged systems. Her crew fought to save her with everything they had, and when that proved impossible, they abandoned her with discipline and courage. More than 2,000 men survived to fight another day. 216 did not. The ship herself now rests 3,000 feet beneath the waves of the Coral Sea, silent and still in the eternal darkness of the deep ocean, a steel tomb for those who went down with her. Yet her legacy echoes across the Pacific and through the remainder of the war. Though the Lexington was lost, though she never saw Pearl Harbor again, never returned to American waters, the road she helped to pave led directly to Midway. And from Midway came the long, grinding campaigns that would eventually lead to ultimate victory. The sacrifices made in the Coral Sea were not wasted. The men who died did not die for nothing. They held the line when holding the line was all that mattered. They stopped the Japanese advance when stopping it seemed impossible. And in doing so, they bought time for America's industrial might to fully mobilize, for new carriers to be built, for new pilots to be trained, for the vast weight of American resources to be brought to bear. The story of the Lexington is a story of courage and sacrifice, of technological innovation and human resilience, of strategic vision and tactical evolution. It's a story about how wars are won not just through individual acts of heroism, though those matter enormously, but through systematic learning and adaptation and the willingness to pay terrible prices for crucial objectives. The men who served aboard Lady Lex knew what they were fighting for. They understood the stakes, and when the time came, they proved willing to sacrifice everything to hold the line against an enemy that had, until that moment, seemed unstoppable.